Frank Holloway thought his war was over. A retired soldier living on the outskirts of a forgotten town, he only wanted peace. But when he finds a wounded dog chained to a bridge in the dead of night, everything changes. The Hollow Men, a brutal underground dogfighting ring, want their property back. And they don't care how much blood they spill to get it. As Frank uncovers the depths of their corruption, he realizes the fight is bigger than he ever expected. With the help of an old friend, a young girl with nowhere else to go, and men who once fought against him, Frank takes a stand. The battle will lead him to a powerful enemy, a man who doesn't just want control, he demands it. The snow falls, the blood spills, and in the end, only one question remains. When the war is over, what comes next? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The storm had been raging for hours, relentless sheets of rain hammering the desolate Texas highway. The wipers on Frank Holloway's truck struggled to keep up, the world beyond them a blur of darkness and water. Thunder rolled across the sky like distant artillery, shaking the earth beneath his tires. He had driven through worse in his time, both on the battlefield and in life. But something about this night felt different. Something was coming. His hands tightened around the wheel, old instincts whispering warnings he couldn't quite place. The road was empty, save for the occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the skeletal trees lining the shoulder. Miles from the nearest town, he had no reason to stop, no reason to do anything but press on toward home. And yet, as he approached the narrow bridge spanning a swollen river, he caught sight of something through the downpour, something that made his gut clench. A shape hunched against the metal railing, small, shaking, alive. Frank slowed, his headlights cutting through the sheets of rain, revealing the unmistakable form of a dog, large, drenched to the bone and chained to the bridge, not just tied, chained. His pulse kicked up. He pulled over, engine rumbling as he reached for the flashlight in his glove compartment. The moment he opened the door, the wind nearly ripped it from his grasp, rain lashing against his face like cold whips. He trudged forward, boots sinking into the mud pooling on the bridge. The dog flinched at his approach, her body curled in on itself, but her eyes, God, her eyes, held something more than just fear. Desperation, pain, a plea. Frank crouched, keeping his movements slow. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath his skin. The chain was thick, bolted to the railing with no slack, no way for her to move more than a few inches. Her fur was matted with mud, her ribs visible beneath the soaked coat. And her belly, he exhaled sharply, pregnant. Someone had left her here to die. The thought hit him like a gut punch. Frank had seen cruelty before, the kind of evil men did when they thought no one was watching. But this was something else. A dog, alone in the storm, abandoned and helpless, carrying life inside her. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted to get rid of her, they had wanted her to suffer. His jaw clenched as he reached for the bolt cutters in his truck bed. The dog growled weakly as he returned, barely more than a warning, but he caught the tremor in it. No fight left. "Not gonna hurt you," he assured her, snapping the cutter's jaws around the chain. One hard squeeze, and the metal gave with a sharp clang. She flinched, but didn't run. Frank hesitated. He had done what he could. Freed her. She could leave now if she wanted, but she didn't move. She just looked up at him, rain running in rivulets down her face. Her body trembling so hard it was a miracle she was still standing. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Sighing, he scooped her up in his arms. She barely weighed anything, just skin and bones beneath the wet fur. Instead of fighting, she pressed her head against his chest, surrendering. Frank carried her to the truck, easing her onto the passenger seat. She curled up instantly, exhaustion overtaking fear. He climbed in beside her, shaking rain from his hands before turning up the heat. "You're safe now," he said, not sure why he was talking to her, maybe to reassure himself just as much as her. The truck rumbled to life. tires splashing through the flooded road as he pulled away from the bridge. The dog, no, she needed a name, watched him with wary eyes. Liberty. The name came without effort. She had been chained and left to die, but now she was free. Liberty. The rain didn't let up as he drove, the storm following him all the way home. By the time he pulled up to his farmhouse, the old wooden structure stood like a sentinel against the dark, the only sign of life in the endless stretch of Texas countryside. Frank parked beneath the overhang, cutting the engine. Liberty didn't stir. Her body curled tight, but her breathing was steady. "Come on, girl," he murmured, lifting her again. She barely reacted, too weak to protest. Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them, the scent of old wood and lingering coffee, a stark contrast to the cold outside. Frank set Liberty down on an old blanket near the fireplace, kneeling beside her. Her ribs showed too much, her fur rough and tangled. Scars marred her legs, faded but deep, not just abandoned, abused. His fingers brushed against her collar, stiff with grime, and something caught his eye. Burned into the leather was a mark, a crude insignia, a circle with jagged lines through it. A brand! Frank's blood ran cold. He had seen marks like this before, long ago, in places where life was cheap and suffering was entertainment. Dogfighting. A sharp breath left him as he stood, rage simmering beneath his skin. Someone had used Liberty, beaten her, broken her, then left her for dead. And he had a feeling it wasn't just her. His gaze dropped back to the dog, her eyes barely open now, but still watching him. She wasn't just a stray. She was evidence. And whoever had done this wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Frank stood in the dim glow of his kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter, his mind replaying the moment he found Liberty on that bridge. The wind, howling through the trees outside, did nothing to settle the unease coiled in his gut. He had been expecting a quiet night, just a drive home through the storm. But now his house wasn't empty anymore. The fire crackled in the other room, the only sound beyond the storm. Liberty lay on the blanket where he'd placed her, her breathing slow, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. The rain had dried from her fur, revealing more of the scars lacing her body. Frank had seen men walk away from war looking like that, carrying marks left by hands that saw them as nothing more than tools. And just like them, Liberty had survived something she never should have. He poured water into a bowl and set it down beside her. The smell of warmed-up chicken filled the air as he placed some shredded meat onto a plate. He crouched near the fire, setting the plate beside her. She didn't move at first. Her eyes flickered open, tracking the food, but there was no trust in her yet. Frank exhaled. "Go on," he murmured. She lifted her head, hesitant, sniffing the plate before lapping up the water first. Then, slow and careful, she took a bite. He stayed still, letting her take her time, watching as she ate like she expected the food to be ripped away at any moment. "You've been through hell," he said quietly, "but that ends here." When the food was gone, Liberty shifted, curling up tighter, eyes flickering shut again. Frank leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His world had been simple before tonight. He had fought his wars, done his time, and chosen solitude for a reason. But this wasn't something he could turn his back on. He had left the battlefield years ago, but some wars had a way of finding you again. He ran a hand down his face, that mark on her collar. He needed to know more. The clock on the wall read just past 2 in the morning, but sleep was out of the question. Frank grabbed his phone and scrolled through his old contacts, people he hadn't spoken to in years, names tied to a life he had tried to leave behind. Eventually, he found the one he needed. Caleb Reese, former MP, a man who knew things about the underbelly of the world. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "You better have a damn good reason for calling me at this hour." Frank didn't waste time. "I need information. Dogfighting rings. You still got eyes on that kind of thing?" Silence, then a slow exhale. "Jesus, Frank. You sure you want to get into this?" "Don't have a choice." Caleb hesitated. "You found one, didn't you?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Yeah, pregnant, scarred, branded." A pause. Then a quiet curse. The branding, was it a circle with jagged lines? Frank's grip on the phone tightened. Yeah, then you just stepped into a hornet's nest. Frank's pulse ticked up. He walked into the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness beyond his porch. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the wind still shaking the trees, but something felt different now. The air was too still. "Talk," he ordered. Caleb sighed. "That mark belongs to a group that calls themselves the Hollow Men. Bunch of sadistic bastards who think they're untouchable. They don't just run fights. They sell trained killers, the kind of dogs that people pay thousands for. And if they dumped her, it means she was either too broken to fight or she knew something they didn't want getting out." Frank clenched his jaw. He glanced toward Liberty. Her ribs still showed, but there was strength under all that damage. "Where do I find them?" Caleb groaned. "Frank, listen to me. These guys aren't just some backwoods operation. They've got connections, cops in their pocket, people who look the other way. You don't want to do this alone." "Never said I would," Frank replied. "Frank, silence." Then Caleb chuckled bitterly. "You're still the same stubborn bastard." Frank didn't argue. "Fine," Caleb said. "I'll ask around. But be careful. If they know you have her, they'll come looking." Frank ended the call without another word. He checked the locks on his doors, his mind already mapping out the next steps. His land stretched far, a good 5 miles of nothing but trees and fields. A perfect place to be alone, a perfect place to be hunted, if someone had the nerve. The wind howled again, rattling the windows. Frank turned off the main lights, leaving only the fire casting shadows across the walls. He walked back to Liberty and sat beside her. "You picked the wrong dog to chain up," he murmured. She didn't move, but her ear twitched slightly as if she had heard. Frank leaned back against the couch, his fingers resting near the pistol on his belt. Let them come. The morning came slow, the kind of grey dawn that barely separated itself from the night. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and pine. Frank Holloway hadn't slept. He sat at the worn wooden table in his kitchen, his black coffee gone cold as he stared at Liberty, who was curled up near the fireplace. She was still asleep, but her breathing was deeper now, more even, safe for the first time in what was likely a long time. His gaze drifted to the collar on the counter, the branded leather twisted and stiff with age. That damn mark! The Hollow Men. Caleb had sounded almost reluctant to tell him more, which meant one thing. This wasn't just some backroom operation run by a couple of sadists. This was organized, the kind of organized that didn't like people sticking their nose where it didn't belong. Frank stood, the chair scraping against the wooden floor as he pushed it back. Liberty's ear twitched at the noise, but she didn't stir. He picked up the collar, turning it over in his calloused hands. He'd seen a lot of things in his life, but there was something about this that burned in a different way. Maybe because the cruelty of war was something he had come to expect, man against man, fighting for whatever cause they clung to. But this was senseless. No honor, no reason beyond the twisted satisfaction of watching something helpless suffer. His jaw clenched. He needed answers. After checking on Liberty one more time, he grabbed his keys and headed out. The air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked dirt as he stepped onto the porch. The road leading from his property stretched long and empty, bordered by dense trees. He kept his eyes on the tree line as he walked to his truck, the unease from the night before still sitting in his gut. It was a short drive to town, but the weight in his chest made it feel longer. Every mile was a reminder of how far he had come to escape the world he used to be a part of, and how quickly it had found him again. The bar was exactly how he remembered it, small, run down, the kind of place that smelled like old cigarettes and spilled whiskey before you even stepped inside. It wasn't even noon, but Frank knew there'd be people here, the kind of people who knew things. He pushed the door open, the hinge creaking loud enough to make a few heads turn. A couple of men sat hunched over the counter. eyes heavy with last night's regrets. In the back, a familiar face sat in a booth, a half-empty glass of cheap bourbon in front of him. Mitch Rourke, drunk, washed up, but still the kind of man who had a habit of knowing things best, left alone. Frank walked over, sliding into the seat across from him. Mitch squinted at him, lips pulling into a smirk. "Holloway, thought you were done with places like this." Frank didn't waste time with small talk. He set the collar down on the table. "Tell me what you know." Mitch's smirk faded the second his eyes landed on the brand. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his unshaven face. "Where the hell did you find this? Does it matter?" Frank's voice was low, edged with something Mitch recognized well: danger. Mitch leaned back, his fingers drumming against the table. "You don't want to get involved with these people, Frank." "I didn't want to." Frank held his stare. "But they made sure I had to." Mitch eyed him for a long moment, then reached for his glass, taking a slow sip before speaking. "The Hollow men have been around for years. Started small, backyard fights, local scumbags looking to make a quick buck. But then someone figured out there was more money in the right kind of cruelty. They started breeding fighters, selling them off to people who wanted something meaner than a gun. You think your dog was lucky getting dumped? You don't want to know what happens to the ones that don't make the cut." Frank's grip tightened against the table's edge. He had seen enough death, enough suffering, to have built up a shield against it. But this was different. "Who runs it?" Mitch let out a humorless laugh. "No one knows for sure. The name floating around is Mason Riker. But no one's ever seen him, at least not in a way they could live to talk about. He's got people, the kind that make sure problems disappear." Frank exhaled slowly, controlling the rage clawing at his chest. He could feel the shift inside him, the old instincts waking up, the part of him that didn't hesitate when it came to putting monsters down. "They operate out of town?" "Yeah," Mitch said, tapping a cigarette from a crumpled pack. "Abandoned barn, a few miles out past the old mill. But don't go looking for trouble, Holloway. These guys play for keeps." Frank pushed back from the table, picking up the collar. "They don't know what trouble looks like," he muttered, standing. Mitch shook his head, watching him go. "Damn fool," he muttered under his breath. The drive back felt shorter, but the storm inside Frank hadn't settled. If anything, it had only grown. As he pulled up to the house, he noticed Liberty was awake, her eyes tracking him through the window. He walked inside, tossing the collar onto the counter before crouching beside her. "They're out there," he murmured, "the bastards who did this to you. And I don't think they're done." Liberty stared at him, something quiet and knowing in her eyes. Frank ran a hand over her head, the decision already made in his mind. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The old mill stood like a forgotten relic on the outskirts of town, its skeletal remains of rusted beams and crumbling brick swallowed by weeds and time. Beyond it, the road turned to dirt, winding through thick woods where the world felt quieter, heavier. This was where men buried things they didn't want found. Frank Holloway had been here before, not this exact place, but places just like it, in the kind of wars that never made the history books. He knew the feeling of walking into darkness with nothing but the certainty that someone was waiting to make sure you never walked back out. He pulled his truck off the road, parking behind a stand of trees where the moonlight wouldn't catch the reflection off the windshield. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and decayed wood, but underneath it was something sharper. Something wrong. Blood. Not fresh, but not old either. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the reassuring weight of the pistol tucked against his ribs. He wasn't looking for a fight tonight. Not yet. He just needed to see, to confirm. The barn sat a quarter-mile past the mill, a long, low structure that had been swallowed by the woods, its roof sagging under the weight of years. There were no lights, no sounds beyond the wind shifting through the trees, but Frank knew better than to trust silence. He moved slow, keeping to the shadows, his boots barely making a sound against the dirt. A broken fence ran along the property. the posts leaning like drunk men, strands of rusted barbed wire curling around them. Then he saw it. Cages. A dozen of them lined up against the barn wall, their metal bars streaked with rust and filth. Some were empty, doors hanging open, but others still held prisoners, shapes barely visible in the dark. Dogs. Frank exhaled slowly, steadying the anger clawing at his ribs. A low growl rumbled from one of the cages, a warning filled with more fear than aggression. Frank crouched, moving closer. The dog inside was a pit bull, its ribs sharp against its skin, one eye swollen shut. Blood crusted its front paws where it had tried to dig, tried to escape. Another cage held a shepherd mix, curled in on itself, trembling. Frank tightened his jaw. These weren't just fighters, they were bait. A door creaked open, spilling dim light onto the dirt. Frank pressed against the barn's side, slipping into the shadows as two men stepped out. "You hear what happened last night?" one of them muttered, lighting a cigarette. "The bridge thing?" the other scoffed. "Yeah, Riker's pissed." Frank didn't move. "Dumb bitch was supposed to be dead by now. Don't know why they didn't just put a bullet in her." Frank's fingers curled into fists. "Riker's got his reasons," the first man grunted. "Says she was worth something once. Might still be." Frank's pulse kicked up. Liberty. "They got a lead on who took her." The man exhaled smoke. "Not yet, but they will." The second man sighed. "You ever feel bad about this shit?" A laugh. "What, the dogs?" A pause. "Yeah." Another drag of the cigarette. "Not my problem. I just do what I'm told." Frank had heard that line before. From men standing in places that reeked of blood and cowardice, from people who let monsters exist because it was easier than fighting them. He shifted, stepping forward. The first man barely had time to turn before Frank's fist caught him under the ribs, driving the breath from his lungs. He crumpled without a sound, his cigarette falling to the dirt. The second man scrambled for his gun, but Frank caught his wrist, twisting hard. The weapon clattered to the ground. Frank drove an elbow into his gut, sending him staggering. The man gasped, clutching his stomach. "Who the hell?" Frank grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the barn. "Where's Riker?" The man struggled, but Frank pressed harder. "Where?" "I don't know. Jesus, man." Frank yanked the knife from the man's belt and pressed it against his throat. "Try again." He trembled. "Not here." "He moves around, doesn't like staying in one place too long." Frank stared at him. "Where does he run things from?" The man swallowed hard. "Bar outside of town. Red Jacks. They do business in the back." Frank nodded. Then he knocked him out cold. The first man groaned from the ground, trying to crawl away. Frank stepped over him and crouched beside the cages, unlatching them one by one. The pit bull limped out first, keeping its distance, watching. The shepherd mix hesitated before creeping forward. Frank stood, stepping back. "Go." They didn't need to be told twice. They vanished into the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Frank turned toward his truck, his mind already on the next step. Riker had made a mistake. He should have killed Liberty when he had the chance. Now Frank was coming for him. Red Jacks sat on the outskirts of town, like something half-rotted but still breathing, its neon sign flickering weakly against the darkness. The kind of place where people went to disappear, where questions didn't get asked unless someone wanted to hear the wrong answer. Frank pulled his truck into the dirt lot, scanning the vehicles lined up outside. Mostly pickups and old muscle cars, but a few bikes too. That didn't sit right. The Hollow men weren't bikers, not in the usual sense, but they worked with the type, the kind of men who liked to take bets on blood. He cut the engine and stepped out, the cold air carrying the scent of beer, gasoline, and bad decisions. Inside, the bar was what he expected. Dim, smoky, the floor sticky with years of spilled whiskey and regret. A jukebox in the corner played something old and twangy. Though no one was listening, the crowd was mixed. Truckers, locals, a few rougher types clustered near the back. And behind the bar, a man Frank recognized, Wayne Miller, a rat, if there ever was one. The kind of man who never picked a side but always knew who was winning. Frank walked up, resting his hands on the counter. Wayne looked up from pouring a drink, his eyes flicking over Frank's face before settling on something behind them. His past, maybe. The kind of past that didn't let men walk away clean. "Holloway," he muttered. "Didn't think I'd see you again. Where's Riker?" Wayne tensed just a flicker, but Frank caught it. "Why the hell you asking?" Frank leaned in. "I found a dog with his mark on her neck, chained to a bridge in the middle of a storm." His voice stayed low, steady. "Tell me where he is, Wayne." Wayne wiped his hands on a rag, pretending to be unbothered. "Even if I knew, I wouldn't be stupid enough to tell you." Frank sighed. Then in one smooth motion, he grabbed Wayne by the collar and yanked him halfway across the bar. Glass rattled, a couple of stools scraped back. Conversations died. Frank kept his voice calm. "Don't make me ask twice." Wayne swallowed hard. "Back room," he muttered. "Through the hall. Second door on the right." Frank let go, adjusting his jacket like nothing had happened. He turned, walking toward the back without looking to see who was watching. He already knew the hallway smelled like sweat and bad choices. A door at the end stood slightly open, revealing a poker game in progress, but the second door on the right, that was closed. Frank tested the handle. Locked. He took a step back, exhaled, then he kicked it in. The door slammed open, bouncing off the wall, and inside, the real Red Jack's revealed itself. A long table, folding chairs, a laptop open on a grainy, flickering video feed. A man hunched over it, startled by the sudden intrusion, and in the far corner, another cage. Frank stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The man by the laptop scrambled for something. Maybe a weapon, maybe an excuse. Frank was on him before he got either. He grabbed him by the back of the neck, slamming his face into the table hard enough to make the laptop jump. The man groaned, his hand twitching toward his pocket. Frank pressed down harder. "Where's Riker?" The man spat blood, groaning. "He's not here." Frank twisted his arm just enough to make it hurt. "That's not an answer." A sharper grunt, then, "Warehouse, outside town. But you don't want to go there." "Man, you really don't." Frank let him go, shoving him against the wall. He turned to the cage in the corner. Another dog, smaller, ribs visible even in the dim light, a muzzle strapped tight across its face. Frank knelt, unlatched the door. The dog hesitated, then took a slow step forward. "You're all right now," Frank muttered. The dog didn't run. Not yet, but its eyes, sharp, knowing, tracked Frank's every move. Footsteps pounded from the hallway. Frank stood, turning toward the door as the first man barreled inside. A fist swung toward his head. Frank dodged left, catching the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The second one charged, knife flashing, but Frank kicked a chair into his knees, sending him sprawling. The first man struggled, cursing, but Frank yanked him back, slamming him face first into the wall. The second man was already scrambling to his feet. Frank didn't let him. One solid punch, straight to the gut, and the fight drained out of him. Wayne's voice echoed from the bar. "What the hell's going on back there?" Frank exhaled. He grabbed the laptop, tucking it under his arm, then turned to the dog. "Come on." He walked out, and this time, the dog followed. Wayne stared as Frank emerged, the dog at his heels, two men groaning behind him. Frank didn't stop. He walked through the bar, out into the cold night air, and didn't look back. He had what he needed, and now Mason Riker had a problem. Frank didn't drive straight home. That would have been stupid. He could feel eyes on him the second he stepped out of Red Jack's, and he knew better than to lead trouble to his doorstep. Instead, he took the long way, a winding path through the back roads, doubling back twice to see if anyone followed. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, the cold night air seeping through the cracked window. The dog sat in the passenger seat, silent but alert. He'd removed the muzzle the moment they left town, and she hadn't made a sound since. No whining, no barking, just watching, the same way Liberty had watched him. Frank glanced at her. Another survivor. Another piece of proof of what Riker and his people had done. His fingers tightened on the wheel. His house came into view, the old farmhouse standing quiet and dark against the night. Frank pulled into the driveway but didn't shut off the engine. He sat there for a moment listening. Nothing, but that didn't mean no one was there. He reached under the seat, pulled out his pistol and tucked it against his hip. Then he stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The dog hesitated, then jumped down beside him. Her ears perked. They walked toward the house together, slow, careful. Frank's gut was telling him something wasn't right. He could feel it, that old instinct coiling in his stomach like a warning. The front door was locked, the windows intact. Nothing seemed off. But when he stepped inside, he knew Liberty was gone. The blanket where she had been lying was empty, the fireplace still warm from the heat of her body. The bowl of water he had left her was overturned, the floor damp where it had spilled. Frank's chest went tight. He scanned the room, searching for any sign of what happened. No blood, no struggle, but the door to the back porch he walked over, pushing it open, unlocked. They had been here. They had come, and they had taken her. Frank exhaled, slow, controlled, forcing the rage down before it took over. Losing control wouldn't help her. He needed to think. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. Holloway. A pause, then a voice, low and amused. You took something that belonged to me, soldier. Frank didn't move, didn't breathe. Mason Riker. I don't think she ever belonged to you, Frank said, his voice flat. A chuckle. See, that's where you're wrong. That bitch was mine, and now I've got her back. Frank's knuckles went white around the phone. Where is she? Another pause. Then, you want her? Come and get her. A click. The line went dead. Frank lowered the phone. The dog beside him let out a low, deep growl. She knew. She understood. Frank exhaled, tucking the phone away. They had made a mistake. They thought they could take Liberty back, use her as leverage. But they didn't understand the kind of man they had just picked a fight with. Frank walked to the hallway, opened the closet and reached up to the top shelf. His fingers found the metal case, pulling it down. He set it on the table, flipped the latches and opened it. Inside, his old rifle gleamed under the dim light. A relic from another life. Frank ran a hand over the stock, his mind already working. Riker wanted a fight. He was about to get one. The warehouse sat deep in the woods, miles from town. It was a fortress, old shipping containers stacked high, makeshift fences built from rusted metal sheets, a place designed to keep people out or keep things in. Frank had been watching for the last 20 minutes, lying flat on his stomach in the dirt, the scope of his rifle trained on the entrance. 4 men, 2 at the gate, another pair patrolling the perimeter. Armed. Not professionals, but they knew their way around a gun. The moon was high, casting long shadows over the yard. Frank stayed still, waiting, listening. Then, movement. A figure appeared near one of the containers, dragging something behind him. Liberty. She was still alive. Frank let out a breath, steady, controlled. He counted the men again. 4 outside, more inside. It wasn't great odds. Didn't matter. Frank moved. He slipped through the trees, staying low, his boots silent against the damp earth. He circled toward the back of the warehouse, where the fence was lower, easier to climb. 1 step at a time. No wasted movement. The first guard never saw him coming. Frank took him down fast and quiet, his knife sliding between ribs, a hand clamped over the man's mouth. He lowered the body to the ground, took the pistol from his belt and moved on. The second guard turned just in time to see the butt of Frank's rifle coming toward his face. A quick strike, out cold, 2 down. Frank pressed against the metal wall of the warehouse, listening. Inside, voices, laughter. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small flare, twisted off the cap. Then he tossed it over the fence. It landed near the front gate, sparking to life. Shouts rang out. What the hell is that? Go check it out. Footsteps. The other 2 guards moving toward the flare, away from the door. Frank slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and wet fur. Cages lined the walls, each one holding a dog, their eyes wide with fear. Liberty was near the center, chained to a post. Frank moved fast, reaching her side, crouching down. Her body trembled, but when she saw him, her tail thumped weakly. Let's get you out of here, he murmured. He pulled out his knife, cutting through the chain. Footsteps. Frank looked up just as Mason Riker stepped into the light, a shotgun resting casually over his shoulder. "Well, well," Riker drawled. "I was hoping you'd come." Frank straightened, his fingers tightening around his rifle. Riker grinned. "I gotta admit, Holloway, I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to walk in here alone." Frank didn't respond, didn't have to. Because outside, gunfire erupted. Riker's grin faltered. "What the—" Frank lunged. The fight was fast, brutal, fists colliding, boots scraping against concrete. Riker was strong, but Frank was stronger, more precise, a punch to the gut, a knee to the ribs, a final blow that sent Riker crashing to the ground, gasping for breath. Frank grabbed him by the collar. "You picked the wrong dog," he said, his voice like gravel. Then he let go. Riker crumpled, coughing, wheezing. Frank turned, scooping Liberty into his arms. The gunfire outside had stopped. He could hear voices, Caleb's voice. Frank carried Liberty toward the exit. It was over. Almost. The night smelled of blood and smoke. The cold wind carried the fading echoes of gunfire as Frank stepped out of the warehouse, Liberty trembling in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her ribs pressing against his forearm with each weak inhale. She had held on this long. She wasn't giving up now. The bodies of Riker's men were scattered across the yard, motionless shadows under the dim glow of the moon. Some were still alive, groaning as they clutched their wounds. But most wouldn't be getting up again. The air was thick with the sharp scent of gunpowder, the ground slick with damp dirt and something darker. Caleb stepped over one of the bodies, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was impassive, but his eyes swept over the scene with the quiet calculation of a man who had seen too many fights end the same way. "You always did have a way of stirring up a damn mess," he muttered. Frank didn't respond. He adjusted his grip on Liberty, making sure she was secure before moving toward the truck. His heart was still pounding, but it wasn't from the fight. It was from the way she barely reacted to being lifted. Caleb followed, shaking his head. "We need to finish this." Frank opened the passenger door, carefully setting Liberty inside on the blanket he had laid out earlier. He ran a hand over her head, his fingers brushing against the ridges of her scars. Her eyes flickered open just for a second before slipping shut again. "She needs a vet," Frank said, his voice low. "I got a guy," Caleb answered. "He doesn't ask questions. But we can't just walk away from this, Frank." He gestured to the warehouse behind them. "They'll rebuild. Maybe not tonight, maybe not next week, but they will. These bastards don't just quit." Frank exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. Caleb was right. The Hollow men weren't just some backyard operation. They had money, connections, men who were willing to do whatever it took to keep their business running. Frank had put a dent in them tonight, but a dent wasn't enough. He closed the truck door, turned back to Caleb. "We burn it," Frank said. Caleb's lips pressed into a tight line, but he nodded. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." They worked quickly. The warehouse was already falling apart, its walls brittle with age, the wood dry enough to catch fire with little effort. Caleb found a stash of gasoline near the back, likely meant for the generators that kept the operation running. Frank didn't hesitate. He splashed the fuel over the crates, the cages, the blood-stained floor. He could still hear the faint sounds of the surviving dogs that had fled into the woods, their howls drifting through the trees. The fire would cleanse this place. Caleb struck the match. The first flame licked up the side of a wooden support beam, curling and twisting like it had been waiting for this moment. Within seconds it spread, crawling along the floor, devouring everything in its path. The old building moaned as the heat took hold, the fire consuming the darkness inside. Frank stepped back, watching the flames rise higher. It wasn't just about destroying the evidence of what had happened here. It was about sending a message, a warning. Riker's empire was crumbling, and Frank wasn't done yet. The flames reached the roof, sparks shooting into the night sky. Caleb glanced at him. "We should go." Frank didn't move right away. He watched the fire eat through the rafters, sending embers floating through the air like dying stars. The heat pressed against his skin, the crackling roar drowning out every other sound. Then he turned and walked to the truck. They drove in silence, the road stretching dark and empty ahead of them. Liberty barely stirred, her breathing still too shallow, her body too still. Frank kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on her side, feeling the faint rise and fall of her chest. Caleb finally spoke. "You know they won't just let this go." "I know. They'll come looking." Frank tightened his grip on the wheel. "Let them." They reached the vet just before dawn, pulling into a gravel lot behind a small, nondescript building on the edge of town. A single light burned above the back door. Caleb knocked twice. A minute later, the door opened. A man in his 60s stood there, his grey hair disheveled, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in his face. He took one look at Liberty and stepped aside. "Bring her in." Frank carried her inside, past shelves of supplies and an examination table covered in clean towels. He laid her down carefully. The vet, whose name was Alan, set to work without asking questions. Frank stood back, watching as he examined Liberty's wounds, checked her breathing, listened to her heart. "She's tough," Alan muttered. "Lucky, too." He glanced up. "She yours?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Alan didn't press. "I'll do what I can." Frank stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap. Caleb followed, lighting a cigarette. The first streaks of daylight were creeping over the horizon, turning the sky a muted grey. Frank stared out at the empty lot, his mind already working through what came next. This wasn't over. Riker was still out there. His operation was burning, but the man himself hadn't been taken off the board, and that meant this war wasn't finished. Caleb exhaled smoke. Exhaled. "You're thinking about going after him?" Frank didn't answer. He didn't have to. Caleb sighed. "Jesus, Holloway." Frank turned to face him. "You said it yourself. They'll rebuild if we don't stop them." Caleb shook his head. "You planning on doing this alone?" Frank met his gaze. "Not if you're in." Caleb studied him for a long moment, then flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "Hell," he muttered. "I was getting bored anyway." Frank nodded. The fire at the warehouse was still burning, miles away, but its message was already spreading. The Hollow Men had lost something tonight, and they would come looking for whoever took it from them. Frank was counting on it. The sun had barely risen when Frank pulled into his driveway. The house stood quiet, untouched, the morning air thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke from the burned-out warehouse miles away. The Hollow Men had lost something last night. He had made sure of it. But losing wasn't something men like Riker accepted easily. He stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound in the stillness. Liberty wasn't home yet. Alan had promised to keep her for a day or two, make sure she was stable before letting her leave. Frank trusted the old vet. The dog he had pulled from Red Jack's, the shepherd mix, was curled up on the porch. She lifted her head when he approached but didn't move, still cautious, still afraid. Frank knew the feeling. He crouched, offering a hand. She didn't flinch, but she didn't come closer either. "You hungry?" he murmured. The dog watched him, but made no move to respond. Frank sighed, pushing himself up. "Suit yourself." Inside, he moved through the house, checking the locks, the windows. Everything was as he left it, but the feeling in his gut told him that wouldn't last. He had fired the first shot. Riker wasn't the kind of man who would take that sitting down. Frank pulled out the laptop he had taken from Red Jack's, setting it on the kitchen table. He powered it on, waiting as the screen flickered to life. A grainy video played automatically. Dogfights recorded in a dimly lit pit, the sound of growling and cheering filling the small kitchen. His jaw tightened. He clicked through the files, searching for something, anything, that would lead him closer to Riker. Then he found it. A list. Names, locations, transactions. People who had paid for dogs. People who had supplied them. People who had taken part in the worst of it. And near the top, highlighted in red, was an address. It wasn't far, a ranch on the outskirts of the next town over. Frank exhaled slowly. He had what he needed. The house phone rang, breaking the silence. His hand hovered over the receiver before picking it up. Nothing. No voice. Just breathing. Frank waited. Then a familiar chuckle. "Yeah, I warned you, Holloway." "Riker." Frank didn't speak. "You should have stayed out of this," Riker continued. "But now you've gone and made it personal." Frank kept his voice steady. "It was personal the moment you left her to die." Silence. Then, "You think you're some kind of hero?" Riker's voice was quiet, dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with, but you will." A click. The line went dead. Frank set the phone down, his pulse steady. It wasn't the first time a man had threatened him over a phone line, and it wouldn't be the last. But it was a mistake, because now he knew what was coming. He moved fast, grabbing his rifle, checking the rounds. Then he pulled open a drawer, taking out the old revolver he hadn't touched in years. He strapped it to his hip, then reached for the shotgun by the door. A familiar weight, a familiar routine. Outside, the dog was still watching him. "Come on," Frank said, stepping onto the porch. "Let's take a walk." She hesitated but followed. The woods stretched behind the house, deep and quiet, the underbrush thick with moisture from last night's rain. Frank moved through the trees, the dog trailing behind. He had grown up in these woods. He knew them better than the roads, better than the town. If Riker sent men, they wouldn't be the first to try and find him here. He stopped at an old oak tree, one that had stood on the land longer than he had. From beneath its roots, he pulled up the metal box. The latch was stiff with rust, but it opened easily enough. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the knife. Not just any knife. The one he had carried through the war, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count. He unwrapped it, feeling the weight in his hand, the balance. Then he slipped it onto his belt. If Riker wanted to play this game, Frank would make sure he regretted it. By the time he got back to the house, the truck was already in the driveway. Caleb. Frank walked up, noting the tension in his old friend's posture. Caleb wasn't a man who spooked easily, but tonight had rattled him. "They made their move," Caleb said, stepping out. "One of my guys saw them, black trucks. No plates, they're watching." Frank nodded. He had expected that. "How many?" "4 vehicles, maybe more. They're sitting just outside town, waiting." Caleb exhaled. "They're not going to wait forever." "No, they weren't." "They'll come at night," Frank said. "They'll try to catch me off guard." Caleb glanced toward the woods. "They don't know what they're walking into." Frank looked at him. "You still in?" Caleb scoffed. "You really asking me that?" Frank nodded once. "Then we set the trap." They moved quickly. The house was prepped, lights cut, exits cleared, weapons loaded. They set up in the woods, where the shadows worked in their favor. And then they waited. Hours passed. The night stretched on. The dog lay beside him, her ears twitching at every sound. Then engines, low, rumbling, moving slow. Headlights flickered through the trees. Frank exhaled. Showtime. The first truck rolled to a stop at the end of the driveway. The second parked just behind it. Doors opened, footsteps on gravel. Then silence. Frank waited. A voice called out, "Holloway." Frank didn't move. "You don't have to make this worse on yourself." Frank exhaled. Then he spoke. "It's already worse." Then he pulled the trigger. The first shot took out the truck's headlights, plunging the yard into darkness. The second sent one of the men stumbling back, cursing. Then the woods erupted. Gunfire cracked through the trees, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night. Caleb fired from his position, dropping one of the men before he could react. Frank moved fast, slipping between the trees, his rifle steady. Another shot, another target down. The men scrambled, shouting orders, but they had already lost. This was Frank's land, his rules. One of the men tried to run. Frank caught him with the butt of his rifle, sending him sprawling into the dirt. He kicked the man's weapon away, crouching low. "Where's Riker?" The man coughed, spitting blood. "Go to hell!" Frank pressed the barrel against his shoulder. "You first!" The man shuddered. He's at the ranch." Frank didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. He stood, stepping back. The fight was over. The survivors were fleeing, dragging their wounded back to the trucks. Caleb exhaled, lowering his weapon. "They'll be back," Frank nodded. "Not for long." Because now he was hunting them. The night stretched long, the scent of gunpowder still thick in the air. The bodies of Riker's men had either fled or bled out where they fell, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and the quiet stillness that came after violence. Frank stood in the cold, his rifle still warm in his hands, his pulse steady, even as the weight of the fight settled deep into his bones. Caleb let out a slow breath beside him, shaking his head as he surveyed the aftermath. "They weren't ready for this," he muttered. Frank glanced toward the tree line where the last of them had disappeared. "They'll regroup." "Yeah." Caleb exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "But they won't hit you like this again. They know better now." Frank wasn't so sure about that. Men like Riker didn't take losses well. They didn't take anything well, except pain, when they were the ones giving it. The dog at Frank's feet, she needed a name, stood tense, her body still wired from the fight. She had stayed low when the shooting started, but she never ran. That meant something. Frank crouched, resting a hand on her back. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He scratched behind her ear, slow, letting her get used to the touch. "You did good," he murmured. Caleb huffed a quiet laugh. "You collecting strays now?" Frank didn't answer. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of sirens. Too far off to matter. By the time anyone came looking, Frank would be long gone. "We need to move," Caleb said. "Take the fight to them before they get their feet under them again." Frank nodded. He already knew where to go. Riker's ranch. It wasn't a home. It was a compound. A place where men like him built their little kingdoms, convinced they were untouchable. Frank had seen places like that before. From the jungles overseas to the deserts where only the worst men survived. And just like all of them, this one would fall. Frank turned toward the truck, but something in his gut pulled him back. A sound, not a threat, not danger, a whimper. He froze. The dog's ears twitched, her head snapping toward the house. Frank followed her gaze, scanning the yard. Nothing. Then he heard it again. It was coming from inside. Frank moved fast, stepping over bodies, past the broken porch, pushing the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The house was dark, the air thick with the remnants of the fight. The furniture was overturned, glass shattered, the scent of oil and sweat clinging to the walls. The sound came again, weak, muffled. Frank followed it down the hall, past the overturned table, past the blood splattered near the front door. He stopped at a closed door. A closet. He didn't hesitate. With one hard yank, he pulled it open, his rifle raised, and froze. A girl. She couldn't have been older than 10, curled up against the wall, her arms wrapped around something small and shivering, a pup. Both of them stared at him, wide-eyed, their bodies trembling. Frank slowly lowered the rifle. The girl didn't move, didn't speak. She was thin, her clothes torn and dirty, her face streaked with something too dark to be just dirt. Her hands clutched the tiny bundle of fur against her chest, her fingers white-knuckled around it. Frank crouched, keeping his voice low. "It's all right," he said. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She didn't respond. Behind him, Caleb cursed under his breath. "What the hell?" Frank shot him a look. Caleb went quiet. The girl's breath hitched, her small frame shaking harder. Frank set his rifle down beside him, making sure she could see. Then, slowly, he reached out his hand. The pup in her arms let out another weak whimper. That was when Frank noticed the blood. Not hers, the pup's. Frank's chest tightened. He kept his voice steady. "I need to help your dog." The girl shook her head, clutching it tighter. Frank didn't push, he just waited. Seconds stretched. Then finally she loosened her grip. Just enough. Frank carefully lifted the pup, cradling it in his hands. Tiny, barely alive. Its fur was matted, its breathing shallow. Its small body limp against his palm. Someone had hurt it. Someone had hurt both of them. Frank exhaled through his nose, forcing the anger down. There would be time for that later. Right now, they needed to move. Frank met the girl's eyes. "We have to go." She hesitated, then slowly she reached for his hand. Frank closed his fingers around hers, steady, firm. "Come on!" She followed. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "Jesus, Frank, what the hell are we supposed to do with her?" Frank glanced down at the girl beside him, at the pup barely breathing in his arms. "She comes with us." Caleb let out a slow breath. "Riker did this, didn't he?" Frank nodded. Caleb shook his head. "Then we don't just take the fight to him." He turned, his eyes cold, steady. "We end him." Frank met his gaze, and for the first time in years he felt something settle deep in his chest. A purpose, a reason. The Hollow men thought they were the ones hunting. They were wrong. Frank lifted the girl into the truck, setting the pup gently on the seat beside her. Then he climbed behind the wheel, his grip firm around the wheel as he pulled onto the road. The night wasn't over. Not yet. The road stretched dark and empty ahead of them, the truck's headlights cutting through the night. Frank kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind already running through the next steps. The girl sat silently beside him, the pup curled in her lap, its breathing slow but steady. She hadn't spoken since he found her, not a single word, but that wasn't surprising. Whatever she had been through, words weren't going to fix it. Caleb rode in the passenger seat, watching the road behind them through the side mirror. "They're going to come after us." Frank nodded. "I know. They won't wait long." "I know that too." Caleb exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn it, Frank, I came here to back you up, not to get involved in some kind of rescue mission." Frank glanced at him. "You want out?" Caleb scoffed. "Not a chance." Frank didn't say anything else. He turned off the main road, taking the back way toward the house. It would take longer, but it was safer. If Riker's men were already searching, they'd be watching the highways first. The girl shifted slightly, her small frame barely making a sound against the seat. Frank glanced at her, then at the pup in her lap. Its ribs showed through its thin fur, its breathing shallow but steady. It needed help. So did she. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She didn't answer. Frank waited a few seconds before trying again. "You got a name?" Still nothing. He nodded to himself. He wouldn't push her. Not now. The truck rumbled down the dirt road, the wheels kicking up dust. The old farmhouse came into view, standing quiet against the trees. No lights, no movement. It looked the same as it always did, but Frank had learned long ago not to trust the way things looked. He pulled up slow, scanning the tree line. Nothing out of place. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the scent of rain and dirt. "Wait here," he told Caleb. Caleb nodded, his fingers resting on his pistol. Frank stepped out, the night air cold against his skin. He moved up the porch steps, testing the door. Still locked. He turned the key, pushing it open. The house was dark, still, the same as he left it. But the feeling in his gut didn't go away. He stepped inside, listening. The floor creaked under his boots, the faint scent of gunpowder from earlier still lingering in the air. He moved room to room, clearing each one the way he had been trained to, his grip firm around his pistol. Nothing. But that didn't mean they hadn't been here. When he was sure the house was empty, he walked back outside, motioning for Caleb. They got the girl inside first, settling her in the small guest room at the end of the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around the pup, her wide eyes tracking every move Frank made. "You're safe here," Frank told her. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." She didn't answer. He figured she wouldn't. He turned to Caleb. "We need supplies. She needs food. The dog needs medicine." Caleb sighed. "And we need ammo." Frank nodded. They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't have to. Frank had spent enough years watching bad men get away with worse things. He'd spent enough nights knowing that there were monsters in the world who never paid for the things they did. Not this time. He grabbed his keys. "I'll go into town. You stay here." Caleb frowned. "Going alone." "They won't move on the house yet," Frank said. "Not until they know how many of us are here." Caleb nodded slowly. "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'll be back." Frank walked out, climbed into the truck, and pulled onto the road. The town was quiet this time of night. A few trucks parked outside the diner, a couple of drunks weaving their way down the sidewalk. Normal. But Frank wasn't looking for normal. He pulled into a small gas station near the edge of town, stepping out and scanning the lot. The attendant behind the counter barely looked up as Frank grabbed what he needed: canned food, bottled water, first aid supplies. He moved quick, efficient, keeping his senses open. Then he saw it. A black truck parked across the street. 2 men inside. Watching. Frank didn't react. He finished at the counter, paid in cash, and walked back to the truck. He set the bags in the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out slow. The black truck didn't move. Not yet. Frank took the long way back, making sure he wasn't followed. He turned onto a side road, cutting through a stretch of woods before looping back toward the house. When he pulled into the driveway, the black truck was nowhere in sight. But that didn't mean they weren't coming. Inside, Caleb met him at the door. "Trouble?" Frank set the bags down. "Not yet, but it's watching." Caleb swore under his breath. "How long do you think we have?" Frank looked out into the darkness beyond the porch, the wind stirring the trees. "Not long." They moved fast. The supplies were stored, the girl given a meal, the pup wrapped in a blanket near the fireplace. She didn't say anything, but when Frank placed the bowl of food in front of her, she ate. That was enough for now. Then they waited. The night stretched on. Thick with the weight of what was coming, Frank sat by the window, his rifle propped against the wall, his eyes scanning the road. And then headlights, far off, moving slow, coming closer. Caleb saw them too. "Looks like we've got company." Frank exhaled. "They made a mistake," he said, standing. Caleb smirked. "How's that?" Frank picked up his rifle, checking the chamber. "They should have brought more men." The first shot rang out just after midnight, and the war came home. The first shot shattered the quiet, the crack of a rifle splitting through the cold night air. Frank had expected them to come, had known Riker wouldn't take his loss lightly. But something about the way the headlights crept down his dirt road, slow and deliberate, told him this wasn't a full assault. Not yet. They were feeling him out, trying to see if he was scared, if he'd run. They didn't know who they were dealing with. He ducked lower behind the window, peering through the darkness. 2 trucks, maybe 5 or 6 men total. Not an army, not yet. Just the first wave, the kind of men Riker sent when he thought the job would be easy. Caleb crouched behind the overturned couch near the doorway, his pistol drawn. He hadn't spoken since the headlights appeared, but he didn't need to. They'd been through enough fights together to know when it was time for talk and when it was time to kill. The girl sat in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide, but silent. The pup was curled against her, sleeping, despite the tension thick in the air. Frank turned back to the window. The trucks had stopped just short of the house, their engines idling. The wind carried the sound of voices, low murmurs, men making plans. Then a voice called out, "Holloway!" Frank knew that voice. Vince Logan, one of Riker's men. A bruiser, the kind that did the dirty work when Riker didn't want to get his hands bloody. Frank exhaled, steady. Then he stood, moving to the doorway. Caleb tensed but didn't stop him. Frank pushed the screen door open and stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder. The cold air bit at his skin, the scent of wet earth and pine thick in his lungs. Logan stood by the front truck, a shotgun resting in his hands. 2 other men flanked him, both armed. The rest stayed back near the trucks, shadows in the dim glow of the headlights. "You know why we're here," Logan called. Frank didn't answer. He just watched. Logan chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, Holloway. Let's not drag this out. You burned Riker's place to the ground. You took what was his." Frank's grip tightened around the rifle. "That dog," Logan continued, "she wasn't yours to take, and neither is the girl." Frank felt his blood turn to ice. They knew. He had been careful, had taken the long way back, but they had known about the girl before tonight, which meant one thing: they had been keeping her. He adjusted his stance, keeping his breathing steady. "She doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low. Logan smirked. "Everything belongs to Riker." Frank exhaled slowly. He shouldered the rifle, lining up the shot. "Not anymore." Logan's smirk faltered. "Now hold on!" Frank pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, the bullet tearing through the night. Logan staggered back, his shotgun falling from his grip as his body crumpled to the dirt. For a second, everything was silent. Then the trucks roared to life. Caleb fired from inside the house, his pistol flashing as the other men scrambled for cover. Frank ducked back behind the porch railing as bullets tore into the wood, splinters flying. The girl screamed. Frank twisted, glancing back. She was still in the corner, the pup clutched against her chest, eyes squeezed shut. "Stay down," he ordered. Caleb fired again, dropping another man near the truck. The rest weren't so eager now. One of them ducked behind the driver's side door, shouting into a radio. Frank knew what that meant. Reinforcements. He cursed under his breath. This wasn't a fight they could drag out. He turned to Caleb. "We need to end this fast." Caleb nodded. "Reloading. What's the play?" Frank looked at the trucks, then at the propane tank sitting near the barn. He made a quick calculation. Then he took aim. The bullet hit the side of the tank, sending a sharp ping into the air. A second later, fire erupted, flames racing up the side of the barn, engulfing the nearest truck in a wall of heat. The men panicked. One tried to run, only to be cut down by another of Caleb's shots. The others scrambled, diving into the remaining truck. Frank aimed again, but before he could fire, the engine revved and the tires spun against the dirt. The truck lurched backward, kicking up dust, before tearing down the road, disappearing into the trees. The fight was over. For now. Frank exhaled, stepping back inside. The girl was still curled against the wall, her eyes locked onto him. She had seen everything. Frank crouched beside her, his voice softer now. "You all right?" She didn't answer. Frank reached out slowly, offering his hand. This time, she took it. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching the flames rise. "They'll be back." Frank nodded. "Yeah." Caleb sighed. "So what now?" Frank stood, his eyes on the road. "They wanted a war," he said. He looked back at the girl, at the pup in her arms, at the scars that ran deeper than skin. They got one. Frank spent the rest of the night preparing. He knew what was coming, knew what kind of men Riker surrounded himself with. They weren't just going to take their losses and walk away. They would regroup, reload, and come back harder. The only way to win this war was to hit them first. Caleb had patched up the defenses around the house, reinforcing the doors, blocking off the weak points. The girl still hadn't spoken, but she stuck close to Frank, her small frame never more than a few feet away. The pup, curled up beside her, seemed to sense the tension thick in the air. As dawn broke, Frank stood on the porch, staring out at the tree line. He had made a decision in the hours between the gunfire and sunrise. Waiting for Riker to come to him wasn't an option. The fight had to be taken to them. Caleb stepped out beside him, arms crossed. "Tell me we're not just sitting here, waiting to get hit again." Frank shook his head. "We go after them." Caleb smirked. "Now you're talking." They loaded up quickly. Ammo, weapons, supplies. They didn't have the numbers, but they had the advantage of knowing what was coming. Frank wasn't just walking into this blind. He had seen the names on that laptop, knew where Riker's men moved, where they felt safe. That was their mistake. He crouched beside the girl, keeping his voice low. "We're leaving for a while. You stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but us. Understand?" She hesitated, her small hands gripping the pup tighter. Then, finally, she nodded. Caleb glanced at Frank as they headed for the truck. "She needs a name," Frank exhaled. "She'll tell us when she's ready." They pulled onto the road, dust kicking up behind the tires. The first stop was a bar on the outskirts of town, not far from where Frank had left bodies bleeding in the dirt. It was the kind of place where men like Riker did business, the kind of place where violence was just part of the scenery. Frank parked down the road, out of sight. They moved on foot, slipping between buildings, keeping low. The bar wasn't open yet, but there were cars outside, men inside. Frank glanced at Caleb. "You ready?" Caleb smirked. "Always." Frank stepped through the front door like he belonged there. The place stank of cheap whiskey and bad choices. 4 men sat at a table near the back, their laughter dying the second they saw Frank. One of them, a thick-necked bastard with a tattoo of a snake running down his arm, stood up slow. "You got some goddamn nerve." Frank didn't let him finish. He moved fast, crossing the room in 2 strides, grabbing the man by the front of his jacket and slamming him into the wall. Bottles rattled behind the bar as the other men shot to their feet. Caleb covered them, pistol drawn, steady, unwavering. Frank pressed his forearm against the man's throat. "Where's Riker?" The man wheezed, his hands clawing at Frank's arm. "Go to hell!" Frank hit him hard, once, the crack of knuckles against bone sharp in the silence. The man gasped, blood spilling from his nose. Frank leaned in. "You think you're the first man to try me?" His voice was low, steady. "Where is he?" The man coughed, spitting blood onto the floor. One of the others, younger, thinner, licked his lips nervously. "They're moving locations since you burned the warehouse." Frank turned his head, eyes locking onto him. "Where?" The young man hesitated. Caleb shifted his aim. "I'd answer if I were you." The man swallowed hard. "Farmhouse. Few miles north of here. He's setting up there now. More men coming in." Frank let go of the thick-necked man, letting him crumple to the floor. He turned to Caleb. "Let's go." The young man looked like he wanted to say something, but Frank was already walking out. They moved fast, the truck kicking up dust as they barreled down the road. Caleb glanced at Frank. "You sure about this?" Frank's grip on the wheel tightened. "It ends today." The farmhouse came into view just as the sun began to dip, a wide stretch of land surrounded by rusted fencing and forgotten machinery. A place built for men who didn't want to be found. Frank pulled off the road, cutting the engine. They moved through the tall grass, staying low, their eyes tracking every movement. There were more men than he expected, at least 10, maybe more, all armed, all ready. Caleb muttered, "This is gonna get loud." Frank nodded. Then he fired the first shot. The bullet tore through the nearest man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Before the others could react, Caleb took out a second. Chaos erupted. Gunfire split the air, men shouting, scrambling for cover. Frank moved fast, keeping low, his shots precise. A bullet clipped his shoulder, but he barely felt it. He ducked behind an old tractor, reloading, scanning the field. Riker was inside. He had to be. Frank motioned to Caleb, then moved toward the house, weaving between cover. One of Riker's men burst from the front door, shotgun raised. Frank didn't hesitate. He put him down with a single shot. Then he was inside. The house smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and old wood. Frank moved through the hallways, his rifle steady. Then he found him. Riker stood in the back room, pistol in hand, his face twisted with rage. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Frank leveled his rifle at him. "It's over." Riker sneered. "You think taking me out changes anything? There'll be someone else. There's always someone else." Frank stepped closer. "Not today." Riker raised his gun. Frank pulled the trigger first. The shot hit Riker square in the chest. He staggered, his breath hitching, then crumpled onto the floor. Caleb appeared in the doorway, gun still raised. "That it?" Frank stared down at Riker's body. He exhaled. "Yeah." Outside, the last of Riker's men were either dead or running. Frank stepped out into the fading light, inhaling deep. The fight was over. Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. "Drinks are on you after this." Frank huffed a quiet laugh. They climbed into the truck, driving back toward home, back toward the girl, back toward whatever came next. The war was over, and Frank had won. The house was quiet when Frank and Caleb pulled into the driveway. Too quiet. The kind of silence that stretched thick and unnatural, pressing down on his chest like a weight. Frank killed the engine, listening. No movement, no barking, no sign of the girl. His gut twisted. He was out of the truck before Caleb could say a word, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward the front door. It was closed, but something about it felt off. The air smelled different, gun oil, sweat, something metallic underneath. Then he saw it. The door frame had been scratched, not broken, not kicked in, but scratched, right where the latch met the wood. A sign, a message. His heart pounded against his ribs. He stepped inside, gun raised, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The living room was the same. The couch still upturned from the fight before. The coffee table where he had left his rifle was undisturbed, but something was wrong. Then he saw the girl's blanket on the floor, the pup's bowl overturned, water pooled beneath it. They were gone. Caleb cursed behind him. Cursed. Damn it, Frank. Frank swallowed the heat rising in his throat. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to think. They had been here not long ago. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a single piece of paper on the table, a scrap torn from a notebook. He picked it up. 3 words, scrawled in messy, heavy ink. Come and get them. His pulse turned to ice. He set the note down carefully, too carefully, then turned to Caleb. They took them. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. I thought we were done with this. So did I. Frank's hands curled into fists, his fingers itching for the trigger of his rifle. Riker was dead. The Hollow men were supposed to be finished. But there was one thing Frank had forgotten. When you cut off the head of a snake, sometimes the body kept moving. There was always someone left, always someone with something to prove. He moved fast, heading to the back room where he kept his maps, his weapons. Caleb followed, jaw tight. Where do we start? Caleb asked. Frank didn't hesitate. The only place left, the ranch. They didn't stop for anything. The truck tore down the dirt road, the sun barely beginning to sink beneath the horizon, casting the land in long shadows. Frank didn't speak. He barely blinked. His grip was tight around the wheel, his mind running through every possibility. The girl had already been through enough. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew the look in her eyes, the way she flinched without thinking. She had already survived hell once. He wouldn't let her be dragged through it again. The pup, too. Something inside him, something raw and ugly, twisted at the thought of either of them in Riker's hands. Except Riker was dead, which meant whoever had them now wasn't just doing business. They were making a point. Caleb checked his rifle. We going in quiet or loud? Frank kept his eyes on the road. We see what we're dealing with first. Caleb nodded. And if they don't give us a choice, Frank's fingers flexed on the wheel, then we burn it down. The ranch sat at the end of a long, unmarked road, hidden behind acres of tall grass and barbed wire. It was bigger than Frank remembered, more vehicles, more men. The Hollow men weren't dead. Not yet. Frank pulled the truck into the trees, killing the lights. They moved on foot, rifles slung low, their steps soundless against the damp earth. The barn was lit from the inside, a dull, flickering glow spilling through the gaps in the wooden walls. Voices drifted from the house beyond it, low murmurs, the occasional burst of laughter. Frank scanned the area. 6 men outside, 3 near the barn, 2 at the porch, 1 walking the perimeter. He looked at Caleb. The girl's in there. The pup, too. Caleb nodded. We do this smart. No mistakes. Frank exhaled. Steady. No mistakes. They split off, moving through the grass like shadows. Frank took the man at the perimeter first, one quick movement, his knife sliding through the ribs before the man could even gasp. He lowered the body into the grass and kept moving. Caleb handled the porch. 2 shots, silenced, precise. The men crumpled before they could sound the alarm, then the barn. Frank reached the doors, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Voices inside. I don't know why we didn't just kill him, one man muttered. Another chuckled. Where's the fun in that? Frank's stomach twisted. He didn't wait any longer. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. 4 men. The girl was in the corner, her arms wrapped tight around the pup, her eyes huge with fear. One of the men had a cigarette dangling from his lips, his boot tapping idly against the wooden floor. He looked up. Frank shot him in the head. The others reacted too slow. Caleb took down the second. Frank moved before the third could draw his gun, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's jaw. The fourth tried to run. Frank put a bullet in his leg and watched him crumble. Then it was quiet. Frank crossed the room, kneeling beside the girl. She stared at him, her breath coming fast. "You're safe now," Frank murmured. She didn't speak, just clutched the pup tighter. Frank turned his head, looking at the man who was still alive, writhing on the floor. He grabbed him by the collar, dragging him up. "Who's left?" The man groaned, coughing up blood. Groaned. You think this is over?" He spat onto the ground. "Mason Riker wasn't the only one running things." Frank's jaw clenched. There was always someone else. Caleb sighed behind him. "You want me to handle this?" Frank stared into the man's eyes, the last glimmer of defiance flickering in them. Then he let go. The man slumped to the ground. Frank turned back to the girl, crouching again. "Let's go home." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out her free hand. Frank took it. The pup whined softly. Frank exhaled. They walked out of the barn, out of the darkness, and into whatever came next. He had won tonight, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The first snowfall of the season drifted down in slow, lazy spirals, covering the broken bodies in a thin layer of white. It softened the hard edges of the blood pooling in the dirt, made the wreckage of the barn look almost peaceful. Almost. Frank stood at the edge of it all, his breath curling in the cold air, his rifle still warm in his hands. Caleb was beside him, scanning the tree line, his own weapon held low but ready. The girl stood just behind them, the pup tucked against her chest, its tiny body trembling more from exhaustion than cold. Frank crouched beside her, keeping his voice low. "You hurt?" She shook her head. He studied her, searching for any sign of injury. There were bruises, dirt smudged across her face, but no blood that wasn't someone else's. She clung to the dog like it was the only thing keeping her grounded, her fingers twisted in its fur. Frank exhaled, standing. "We need to move." Caleb wiped at his nose, sniffing. "They'll come looking for this. For them." Frank glanced at the dead men sprawled across the barn floor, their bodies stiffening in the cold. "Let them." They moved fast, slipping into the trees, leaving the bodies to freeze. There was nothing left here but ghosts. The truck was parked a mile out, hidden off a dirt road that hadn't been driven on in years. By the time they reached it, the girl's steps had slowed, her small frame sagging with exhaustion. Frank lifted her without a word, settling her into the back seat, the pup curled in her lap. Caleb shut his door with a sigh. "We got lucky." Frank started the engine, watching the girl in the rearview mirror as she curled up against the seat. Luck had nothing to do with it. The drive back was slow, careful. The snow thickened as they neared home, the road vanishing under a blanket of white. The girl slept, one arm wrapped protectively around the pup, her breathing steady. Frank pulled into the driveway, killing the engine. The house was dark, the porch covered in a fresh layer of snow. For a moment it almost felt normal. Almost. Inside, Frank set the girl up in the spare room again, making sure she had blankets, that the pup had water. She didn't speak, just watched him with those quiet, tired eyes. Caleb leaned against the doorway. "We should talk." Frank followed him into the kitchen, where Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of him. "Who the hell was running things if Riker wasn't the only one?" Caleb muttered. Frank rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. "We missed something." Caleb took a slow sip. "You think it's done, and then someone else steps up." He huffed a quiet laugh. "This is why I hate these kinds of guys. They don't know when to stay dead." Frank drummed his fingers against the table. "That man I let live, he said Riker wasn't the only one." Caleb nodded. "Yeah, and now he's going to tell whoever's left exactly where to find us." Frank's jaw tightened. He had known the second he let that man crawl away that it wasn't over. He had seen it before, in places where war never truly ended, only changed hands. The Hollow Men had been built on fear and blood. Someone had to be holding the leash, and now they knew where to bite. Caleb finished his coffee, pushing back from the table. "We need a plan." Frank stared at the snow falling outside, his mind already working. They wouldn't wait long. Neither would he. The first shot came just after midnight. A window shattered, glass spraying across the floor. The girl bolted upright in bed, the pup barking frantically. Frank was already moving, rifle in hand, stepping into the hallway just as the second shot tore through the front door. Caleb crouched low by the window, gun drawn. They didn't waste any damn time. Frank peered through the broken glass. Figures moved in the trees, dark shapes against the snow. 5, maybe 6. The fresh snowfall gave them away, their footsteps crunching even through the gunfire. "They're testing us," Caleb muttered, "seeing if we'll run." Frank chambered around. "Then let's show them we won't." The girl huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around the pup, her breath coming in quick bursts. Frank moved to her, crouching low. "You stay here," he said, his voice calm despite the storm raging outside. "Don't open the door for anyone but me or Caleb. You understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide. Frank turned back to Caleb. "Cover me." He moved fast, slipping out the back, boots crunching in the snow. The cold hit him like a slap, the wind biting against his skin. He kept low, circling wide through the trees, the rifle steady in his hands. He saw the first man before the man saw him. Frank didn't hesitate. The shot was clean, precise, the man dropping without a sound. The others reacted too slow. They weren't trained for this. They were used to fear doing half the work. But fear didn't work on men like Frank. Another shot, another body in the snow. Gunfire erupted from the house, Caleb holding them off. Frank moved through the trees like a ghost, tracking the last 2 men as they scrambled toward their truck. He fired once, hitting the driver in the leg, sending him sprawling. The last man hesitated, just long enough for Frank to close the distance. The knife was faster than the gun. The man gasped, choking as Frank twisted the blade. Then he slumped forward, his body hitting the snow with a dull thump. The last man, the one with the wounded leg, crawled backward, his breath ragged. "Wait!" Frank didn't wait. He grabbed him by the collar, dragging him through the snow. The man struggled, cursing, but he was weak, bleeding. Frank dropped him in front of the truck. "Who sent you?" The man coughed, his breath steaming in the cold. "You already know." Frank stared down at him, his jaw clenched. "Say it." The man swallowed. "Carlyle." Frank exhaled through his nose. The name was familiar. Was a ghost from an old war, the kind fought in shadows, the kind that never really ended. Caleb appeared at his side, shaking his head. "Son of a bitch!" Frank turned back to the man, his breath steady, controlled. "Tell Carlyle I'm coming." The man's eyes went wide. Frank lifted his rifle. One shot. One. The snow swallowed the sound. Caleb sighed. "We're really doing this, huh?" Frank looked back toward the house where the girl waited. He nodded. "Yeah." They walked through the falling snow, back toward the only home Frank had left. The war wasn't over, but he was ready to finish it. The sun was just beginning to rise, staining the snow-covered land in pale shades of gold and crimson. Frank stood on the porch, rifle in hand, his breath curling in the freezing air. The bodies had been dealt with, some buried in shallow graves, others left for whatever scavengers roamed these woods. The Hollow men had come again, thinking they could break him, thinking they could take back what they'd lost. They were wrong. Caleb sat on the steps, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his face drawn tight from exhaustion. "Carlyle," he muttered, shaking his head. "Didn't think I'd hear that name again." Frank didn't respond. He just stared out into the trees, waiting for the next move. The snow lay undisturbed now, save for the tracks they had left in blood and boot prints. Inside the house, the girl was asleep again. She had curled up in the corner of the couch, the pup tucked against her, its tiny body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. She hadn't spoken a word about what happened last night, but Frank knew the weight of it was settling into her bones, just like it had settled into his a long time ago. Caleb exhaled smoke into the cold air. "We need a plan," Frank nodded. "We already have one." Caleb let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, because I'm pretty sure we've been winging it for the last 48 hours. Frank finally turned to look at him. We take the fight to Carlisle. Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Frank, this guy, he's not Riker. He's worse. I know. Caleb studied him for a long moment. You really think we can pull this off? Frank's jaw tightened. We don't have a choice. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, so what's the play? Frank motioned toward the truck. We go into town, find someone who's still got connections. We need to know where he's set up, how many men he's got. Caleb smirked. Sounds simple enough. Frank grabbed his coat, pulling it over his shoulders. It won't be. They moved fast, leaving before the girl woke up. Frank hated leaving her behind, but they needed information, and bringing her into town wasn't an option. Not yet. The truck rumbled down the road, the snow crunching under the tires. The town was just starting to stir, lights flickering on in houses, people bundling up against the cold as they went about their routines. But something felt off. The streets were quieter than usual. A couple of shops that should have been open were still dark. The usual morning traffic was thinner. Caleb noticed it too. They're afraid. Frank kept his eyes forward. They should be. He pulled up to a small diner near the edge of town. It was the kind of place that had been there forever, the kind where people talked if you knew how to listen. They stepped inside, the warmth hitting them like a wall. A few heads turned, eyes scanning over them before going back to their coffee. The man they were looking for was already there. Bobby Lynch. He had been a low-level enforcer back in the day, running collections for people like Carlisle. But time had softened him, and now he was just another man trying to stay out of trouble. Frank slid into the booth across from him. Bobby? Bobby sighed. Christ, Holloway. You know how much trouble you bring just by sitting here? Caleb smirked. Wouldn't be the first time. Bobby wiped his hands on a napkin, glancing toward the window. I heard what you did to Riker's people. Frank didn't say anything. Bobby exhaled sharply. Carlisle's already making moves. You think he's just going to let you walk away from this? No, Frank said simply. Bobby shook his head. You don't get it. Riker was small time. Carlisle, he's the real thing. He's got money, connections. Hell, half the sheriff's department probably answers to him. Frank leaned in. Where is he? Bobby swallowed. You don't want to go looking for him. Frank just stared. Bobby sighed, rubbing his temples. There's an old lodge, up in the mountains near Black Hollow Ridge. He's been using it as a base since Riker got taken out. More men coming in every day. Frank nodded. Bobby lowered his voice. You really gonna go after him? Frank didn't answer. Bobby shook his head. You're a dead man, Holloway. Frank stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. We all die someday. Back in the truck, Caleb let out a low whistle. A mountain lodge. That's not gonna be easy. Frank checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. It never is. They drove back in silence, the road stretching long and empty ahead of them. The snow had stopped, but the cold still pressed in, biting at Frank's skin through his jacket. When they pulled into the driveway, Frank knew something was wrong. The front door was open. He was out of the truck before the engine had fully shut off, his boots hitting the snow hard. He moved fast, his rifle raised as he stepped inside. The girl was gone, the pup too. The blanket she had been wrapped in was tossed onto the floor, the air still carrying the faint scent of something unfamiliar. Cologne, smoke, something expensive. A single bullet sat on the table, standing upright. A message. Caleb came in behind him, swearing under his breath, Frank! Frank didn't move, didn't breathe. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. They had taken her. And that meant only one thing. Carlisle had just made his last mistake. The weight of the bullet on the table felt heavier than it should have. A simple message, deliberate and cruel. They had taken the girl, they had taken the pup, and they wanted Frank to know they had done it without a fight. Caleb stood frozen in the doorway, his breathing slow, measured. Frank could hear the tension in it, the way his old friend was holding back the urge to break something. But Caleb wasn't the one they wanted to break. Frank picked up the bullet, rolling it between his fingers, a .45, meant for him. Carlyle wanted him to know this was personal. Frank placed the bullet back on the table with careful precision. Then he turned to Caleb. "We're leaving." Caleb nodded. "Yeah, now." They moved fast. Frank grabbed his rifle, checked his sidearm, pocketed extra ammo. He had been prepared for a fight, but now it was more than that. It wasn't just about ending Carlyle, it was about bringing her home. Outside, the truck idled, exhaust curling into the cold morning air. The snow was thick, undisturbed except for their own footprints. They had come in quiet, slipped in and out without leaving a trace. Frank climbed in, his knuckles white around the wheel. Caleb adjusted his rifle in the passenger seat. "How do you want to play this?" Frank pulled onto the road, tires crunching through the ice. "We find her, we kill him." Caleb smirked, but there was no humor in it. Straight to the point. "I like it." The road stretched long and empty ahead of them. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark against the pale sky. The lodge wasn't far. They'd be there before the sun reached its peak. Frank drove fast but controlled, every second tightening the coil in his chest. The girl was alone with those men. He didn't know how much time she had before Carlyle decided to make a statement. He wouldn't give him the chance. They reached the edge of Black Hollow Ridge within an hour. The trees were dense, the road narrowing as it wound up the mountain. The air was different here, colder, quieter. Frank slowed the truck, pulling off the road, parking it behind a thick stand of trees. Caleb glanced at him. "Going in quiet?" Frank checked his rifle, chambering around. Not for long. They moved through the trees, keeping low, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The lodge came into view through the branches, a massive structure of dark wood and glass, standing like a fortress in the middle of nowhere. 3 trucks were parked outside. A few men stood on the porch, smoking, laughing, too relaxed. They weren't expecting a fight. Frank crouched beside Caleb, studying the layout. Caleb whispered, "She's inside." Frank nodded. "We get her first, then we finish this." They moved fast, cutting around the side of the lodge, keeping to the trees. A side entrance was half covered in snow, untouched by recent traffic. Frank tested the handle. Locked. He stepped back, raised his rifle, and slammed the butt against the lock. The door splintered open. They slipped inside. The hallway was dim, the scent of whiskey and cigar smoke thick in the air. Footsteps creaked above them. 2nd floor. Frank moved silently, his body a ghost of old training, old instincts. Caleb covered his back, eyes scanning the shadows. Then, voices, upstairs. Frank took the steps 2 at a time, his grip firm on his rifle. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors. He listened. 3rd door on the right. He stepped forward, slow, controlled, then kicked it open. The girl sat on the bed, curled against the headboard, the pup shivering in her arms. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. Frank didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, lifting her gently. "We're leaving." She clung to him, her small fingers digging into his jacket. Caleb stood in the doorway, gun raised. "We've got company." Footsteps thundered down the hall. Frank turned, shielding the girl. The first man rounded the corner. Caleb shot him before he could raise his weapon. The second man fired. The bullet clipped the doorframe, missing by inches. Frank ducked, pulling the girl close. Caleb fired again. Another body hit the floor. Then the voice. "You made a mistake." "Holloway, Carlyle." Frank turned slowly. Carlyle stood at the end of the hall, a pistol resting at his side. He wasn't in a rush. He thought he had the advantage. Frank set the girl down, pressing her against the wall. "Stay behind me," Carlyle smirked. "You really think you're walking out of here?" Frank raised his rifle. "Yeah." Carlyle's smirk didn't falter. "You're predictable. That's why this was so easy." Frank exhaled, then pulled the trigger. Carlyle hesitated, just for a second. Frank shot him in the chest. Carlyle staggered, his body slamming against the wall. His pistol clattered to the floor. He gasped. Eyes wide, blood spreading across his shirt. Frank stepped forward. "You should have stayed in the dark." Carlyle gurgled something, a curse, maybe a plea. Frank didn't care. He fired once more. Carlyle slumped forward. It was over. Caleb exhaled. "Damn." Frank turned to the girl. "It's done." She didn't speak, just nodded. Caleb peered down the hallway. "More will be coming." Frank lifted the girl into his arms, the pup still clutched against her chest. "Then we don't stay." They moved fast, out the back, through the trees. The first rays of morning light cut through the branches, streaking the snow in shades of red and gold. By the time they reached the truck, the lodge was burning behind them. Frank didn't look back. He climbed into the driver's seat, his grip easy on the wheel. Caleb let out a slow breath. So what now? Frank glanced at the girl in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her fingers still tangled in the pup's fur. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't driving toward a fight. He was driving toward something else, something that felt a hell of a lot like home. The truck rumbled down the snow-covered road, the weight of the past few days pressing into Frank's bones. The lodge was behind them, nothing more than a smoldering ruin by now, but the fire hadn't erased the truth. Carlyle was dead. The Hollow men were scattered, but something in Frank's gut told him this wasn't over. It was never that easy. Caleb sat beside him, silent, staring out at the endless stretch of frozen land. In the back seat, the girl and the pup were curled together, both asleep. The girl's face was still marked with exhaustion. Her small fingers twisted in the dog's fur, like she was afraid to let go. Frank checked the rearview mirror. The road behind them was empty, but he didn't trust it. Not yet. "They're gonna come looking," Caleb muttered. Frank kept his eyes on the road. "Let them." Caleb huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, that's what I figured you'd say." They rode in silence for a few more miles before Caleb shifted in his seat, rubbing a hand over his face. "We need a plan, a real one." Frank nodded. "We get back to the house, we make sure she's safe, then we figure out what comes next." Caleb exhaled sharply. "She needs more than just a safe house, Frank." Frank gripped the wheel tighter. He knew that. He had known it since the moment he found her in that closet, holding on to a dying pup like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. But knowing it and fixing it were two different things. "First we handle the Hollow men," Frank said. "Then we talk about the rest." Caleb shook his head, but didn't argue. The road stretched long and quiet ahead of them, but the peace was temporary. It always was. They reached the house just after sunset. The girl barely stirred when Frank carried her inside, her small frame light against his arms. He settled her in the guest room, tucking the blanket around her. The pup curled up beside her instantly, pressing against her warmth. Frank stood there for a moment, watching her sleep. She hadn't said a word since he'd found her, not one. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she'd come from. All he knew was that she was here now, and she had nowhere else to go. That was enough. For now. He closed the door quietly, then walked back to the kitchen where Caleb was pouring a cup of coffee, his expression dark. "You should see this," Caleb said, nodding toward the table. Frank stepped forward. A newspaper lay open, today's edition. 3 bodies found near Black Hollow Ridge. Gunfire reported. No suspects. Frank exhaled through his nose. "They're covering it up." "Yeah," Caleb muttered, "which means whoever's left is still pulling strings." Frank rubbed his jaw, thinking. Riker had been the face, Carlyle the real power, but there had to be someone else keeping this machine running. Someone with enough reach to keep law enforcement out of it. And if they still had men left, they'd need leadership. That meant one thing. Some of Riker's former enforcers were scrambling for control. Frank sat down, rolling his shoulders. "We find them before they regroup," Caleb smirked. "You sure do love the direct approach." Frank didn't smile. "You got a better idea?" Caleb exhaled. "Yeah, we flipped them." Frank frowned. "What?" "Some of Riker's guys. Most of them were just muscle, hired guns. They don't care who they work for, as long as they're getting paid." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You go after every last one of them, and you'll be fighting ghosts forever. But if we pull a few of them over to our side, that changes things." Frank considered it. It wasn't a bad plan. It wasn't his usual way of doing things. But then again, this wasn't his usual fight. "They won't just roll over," Frank said. "No," Caleb agreed. "But they're already scared. We just need to give them a reason to be more scared of us than whoever's left. Frank nodded slowly. All right, where do we start? Caleb smirked. I know a guy. They met him at an old auto shop on the outskirts of town, a place that had seen better days. The garage door was half open, the dim light from inside flickering against the snow. Frank and Caleb stepped inside, their boots echoing against the concrete. A man stood near the back, wiping his hands on a rag, watching them with wary eyes. You got some nerve showing up here, he muttered. Frank tilted his head. We could say the same. The man, Eddie James, had been one of Riker's enforcers. Not the worst of them, but not innocent either. He had done his share of dirty work. Caleb leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. We know what's happening, Eddie. Riker's gone, Carlisle's gone. That leaves a lot of guys wondering where their next paycheck is coming from. Eddie tensed. If you're here to put me in the ground, just get it over with. Frank shook his head. Not today. Eddie frowned. Then why are you here? Frank stepped closer. Because you've got a choice. Keep working for dead men, or work for us. Eddie let out a sharp laugh. Work for you? Doing what exactly? Caleb smirked, making sure this town never falls into the wrong hands again. Eddie shook his head. That sounds a lot like a suicide mission. Frank met his eyes. Maybe, but the alternative is worse. Eddie studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Hell, I don't know. You really think you can end this? Frank didn't blink. I know we can. Eddie exhaled. You pull this off, Holloway, and people are going to remember your name for a long time. Frank didn't care about that. He just cared about making sure the girl in his house never had to live in fear again. Eddie hesitated, then nodded. All right, I'm in. Frank turned to Caleb. Who's next? Caleb grinned. I got a list. Frank nodded. Then let's get to work. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they had a shot at winning. Frank wasn't used to people relying on him. He had spent years moving through the world like a ghost, a soldier with no battlefield, a man with no home. But as he stood in the middle of town, watching the small crowd that had gathered outside Eddie's garage, he realized something had shifted. These people weren't just waiting to see what would happen. They were looking at him like he had the answers. And damn it, maybe he did. Caleb leaned against the truck beside him, arms crossed. This is the most people I've seen in one place since the county fair. Frank scanned the faces, men and women, business owners, mechanics, ranchers. Some of them had suffered under the Hollow men for years, forced to pay for protection, too scared to fight back. Others were just tired of living in fear. Eddie stood near the garage door, rubbing his jaw. All right, Holloway, you got them here. What now? Frank took a slow breath. He hadn't planned a speech. He had never been much for words. But these people needed something to hold on to. We're not waiting for them to come back, he said, his voice steady. Riker's gone. Carlisle's gone. But there are still men out there who think they can run this town the same way. They're wrong. A few murmurs ran through the crowd. Some of them looked hopeful. Others looked doubtful. Frank continued. Frank, for too long you've been told to keep your heads down, to let the wrong people make the rules. That ends now. A man near the front, one of the ranchers, shook his head. Easy to say, but what happens when they send more men? When the next Carlisle shows up? Frank met his eyes. Then we show them this town isn't theirs to take. A woman, maybe in her 50s, stepped forward. She owned the feed store, if Frank remembered right. You're talking about fighting? Frank shook his head. I'm talking about standing together. They picked us off because they thought we were alone. We're not. Caleb pushed off the truck. The Hollow men don't have a base anymore. The network is falling apart. We've got a window here, but we have to act fast. Eddie nodded. So what's the plan? Frank turned to the crowd. We build something stronger than what they had. We protect each other. We watch the roads. We make sure they know that coming back here is a mistake. The rancher crossed his arms. And if they do come back, Frank's jaw tightened. Then we handle it. Silence stretched. Then, slowly, one of the men nodded. Then another. The woman from the feed store exhaled. "All right, Holloway, tell us what you need." Frank didn't smile, but something settled in his chest. They weren't just listening, they were ready. The next few days passed in a blur of work. People who had once kept to themselves started talking, started organizing. Patrols were set up along the back roads. Eddie and a few other former Hollow men took it upon themselves to train the younger guys, the ones willing to fight if it came to that. Frank didn't stop moving. There was too much to do. Reinforcing businesses, setting up a supply chain for weapons and equipment, making sure the sheriff's office, which had been useless for years, knew that the people of this town weren't waiting for help that would never come. He spent his nights at the house, watching over the girl. She was still quiet, still cautious, but she had stopped flinching when he walked into a room. One night, as he sat by the fire cleaning his rifle, she finally spoke. "You're not like them." Frank looked up. The pup was curled in her lap, its tiny chest rising and falling with sleep. He set the rifle down. "Like who?" "The men from before." Her voice was small but steady. "The ones who hurt people." Frank exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "I'm not." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, like she had decided something. "My name's Lily." Frank let the name settle. He nodded. "All right, Lily." She shifted, pressing her cheek against the pup's fur. "Are they going to come back?" Frank didn't lie to her. "Maybe." She looked up. "Are you going to stop them?" Frank met her eyes. "Yes." Lily nodded again, like that was enough. Then she rested her head against the pup and fell asleep. Frank sat back, staring into the fire. For the first time in a long time, he had something to fight for. The first test came at dawn, 2 weeks later. Frank had been up before the sun, checking the perimeter, making sure the defenses were still solid. The air was sharp with frost, the sky streaked with pale light. Then he saw the dust rising on the road, a black SUV. It rolled in slow, stopping just at the edge of town. Frank didn't wait. He grabbed his rifle, motioned to Caleb, and headed for the street. By the time they reached the vehicle, a few other men had gathered. Eddie, the rancher, a couple of others who had been watching the roads. The SUV door opened. A man stepped out. Not one of Riker's, not one of Carlisle's. Someone new. He was tall, sharp-eyed, dressed clean, like he belonged in a city somewhere. Not here. He looked at Frank. "You're Holloway." Frank didn't answer. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've made quite a mess." Frank didn't move. "Who do you work for?" The man tilted his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" Frank tightened his grip on the rifle. "If you're here to make a deal, you're wasting your time." The man chuckled. "No deals, Mr. Holloway, just a warning." Frank didn't blink. "Go ahead." The man's smile faded. "You think you've won. You think you've built something strong here, but the people I work for, they don't forget." Frank stared him down. "Neither do I." A long pause. Then the man sighed. "Have it your way." He turned, stepped back into the SUV. The vehicle rolled back down the road, disappearing into the dust. Eddie let out a breath. "That was different." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, and I don't like it." Frank watched the road. This wasn't over. It never was. But they were ready. For the first time in a long time, they were ready. Frank stood on the porch, watching the last traces of dust settle in the wake of the black SUV. The man in the suit had delivered his message, and Frank had heard plenty of threats before. But this one felt different. Not because it was more dangerous. Danger was something Frank understood, but because it was calculated. The Hollow men had been brutes, relying on fear and muscle, but whoever was left was smarter, more patient. That meant they weren't done yet. Caleb leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "So, what do we do?" Frank exhaled, his breath misting in the cold air. "We keep building." Caleb gave him a sideways glance. "That's simple, huh?" Frank turned, heading inside. "Nothing about this is simple." The house was warm, the fire crackling low in the hearth. Lily sat on the couch, the pup curled against her side, chewing on an old leather glove Frank had given it. She looked up when he walked in, her eyes flicking between him and Caleb, reading their expressions the way only a kid who had seen too much could. Frank crouched beside her. "How's he doing?" Lily ran a hand over the pup's head. "Better." She hesitated, then asked, "Did something happen?" Frank could have lied, told her everything was fine, but he wasn't the kind of man who did that. "Someone came by," he said. "Tried to scare us." She watched him carefully. "Did it work?" Frank shook his head. She nodded like she had expected that answer, then looked back down at the dog, running her fingers gently through its fur. Frank stood, rubbing a hand over his face. He was running on little sleep and too much adrenaline, but that was nothing new. He glanced at Caleb. "We need more men." Caleb sighed. "Yeah, I figured that was coming." Eddie had already brought a few of Riker's former guys onto their side, men who had realized they were working for the losing team, but they needed more than just bodies. They needed people willing to fight for something bigger than a paycheck. Caleb grabbed his coat. "Guess it's time to go recruiting." Frank nodded. "Be careful who you bring in." Caleb smirked. "Aren't I always?" Frank didn't answer. They both knew the truth. Caleb left, heading back into town to start putting the word out. Frank turned to Lily, who was still petting the pup absent-mindedly. She hadn't spoken much since the night they rescued her, but she was getting there. He sat across from her, studying the way she curled around the dog, like she was still afraid something would take it away. "What was his name?" Frank asked. Lily blinked, confused. "The dog," Frank clarified. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I never named him." Frank nodded slowly. "You should." Lily looked down at the pup, thinking. Then finally she said, "Lucky." Frank let the name settle between them. "That's a good name." Lily nodded. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Frank stood, moving toward the door, his rifle resting easy in his hands. He checked the locks, the windows, the perimeter, habit, instinct. When he turned back, Lily was watching him. "You don't stop," she said quietly. Frank leaned against the doorframe. "No," she tilted her head. "Why?" Frank thought about it, thought about the years of war, the nights spent tracking men in the dark, the weight of knowing what people were capable of. "Because stopping gets people killed," he said finally. Lily didn't look away. "That's why you fight?" Frank let out a slow breath. "Yeah." She considered that for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she said, "Me too." Frank felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't quite place. Before he could respond, a knock echoed against the door. Frank's body moved before his mind caught up, his rifle raised, his breath steady. He glanced through the peephole, relaxing slightly, when he saw Eddie standing outside, bundled against the cold. He opened the door. "You're early." Eddie stepped in. Eddie, shaking snow off his jacket. "Yeah, well, I figured you'd want to hear this sooner than later." Frank closed the door. "What is it?" Eddie pulled off his gloves, rubbing his hands together. Words spreading fast. "Most of the guys who worked for Riker are either running scared or looking for a new boss. And that's the problem." Frank frowned. "What do you mean?" Eddie sighed. "There's someone trying to take over. Not one of ours, not one of Carlisle's, but someone new. Calls himself Mercer." Frank rolled the name over in his head. It didn't mean anything to him, yet. "He's got money," Eddie continued. "Connections. And he's looking to rebuild what you burned down." Frank's jaw tightened. He had known the fight wasn't over, but he had hoped for more time. Caleb's words from earlier echoed in his head. "You go after every last one of them, and you'll be fighting ghosts forever." Frank wasn't interested in ghosts. He was interested in ending this. For good. Eddie shifted, lowering his voice. "I know some of the guys working with him. They're not loyal. If we move fast, we can flip them." Frank nodded. "Do it." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "That easy?" Frank stared at him. "The sooner this ends, the better." Eddie let out a slow breath. "All right, I'll put the word out." Frank walked him to the door. Before Eddie left, he turned back. "You ever think about what happens after?" Frank frowned. "After what?" Eddie smirked. "After there's no one left to fight." Frank didn't have an answer for that. Eddie chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, didn't think so." Then he left. Frank closed the door. locking it behind him. Lily was still watching him from the couch, Lucky asleep in her lap. "You don't think about after?" she asked. Frank sat down, resting his hands on his knees. "I never used to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "Maybe you should." Frank stared into the fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood, the wind against the windows. Maybe. But first, he had a war to finish. The final storm came at night. Frank had known it would. He could feel it in the air, thick with the weight of unfinished business. The Hollow men were all but gone, their leadership broken, their grip on the town shattered. But Mercer wasn't the kind of man to let things slip through his fingers. He wanted power, and power meant control. He needed to make a statement. Frank was going to make sure that statement ended with him bleeding in the snow. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. Lily was asleep on the couch, Lucky curled against her. Caleb had taken first watch, sitting near the window with his rifle across his lap. Frank had barely closed his eyes when Caleb muttered, "We've got movement." Frank was on his feet in seconds. He crossed the room in 3 strides, looking through the scope of his rifle out into the trees. Shadows, moving slow, keeping low. They weren't amateurs this time. They brought pros, Caleb murmured. Frank nodded. Mercer's men. The last of the Hollow men had been little more than hired thugs. But Mercer had money. That meant he could afford something better. Mercenaries, killers, people who didn't flinch when a job got messy. Frank glanced back at Lily. She was still asleep, breathing deep and even. She hadn't woken up screaming in days. Maybe she finally believed she was safe. She wasn't. Not yet. Frank turned to Caleb. "We hit first." Caleb grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." They moved fast. Frank grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, then slung it over his shoulder. Caleb did the same. They had the advantage here. The house was their ground. The land was theirs. The men in the woods were hunting, but they didn't realize they had walked straight into a trap. Frank motioned for Caleb to take the left side. He took the right, slipping out into the cold. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow and gun oil. The woods were still, the silence stretching like a taut wire. Then, movement. Frank spotted one of them first. Dressed in black, moving low through the brush, his rifle raised. He wasn't moving like a Hollow man. He was disciplined, trained, but not enough. Frank lined up his shot and pulled the trigger. The man dropped without a sound. A second later, Caleb fired. Another body hit the snow. Then the night erupted. Gunfire split the silence, sharp bursts of light flashing between the trees. The men in the woods scattered, trying to find cover. Frank moved. He weaved through the trees, his boots silent in the snow, keeping low. One of Mercer's men was crouched near a fallen log, scanning the darkness. Frank flanked him, raising his rifle. The shot was clean. The body slumped against the log. Something cracked behind him. Frank spun, barely dodging the knife aimed for his ribs. The man moved fast, lunging again, blade flashing in the moonlight. Frank blocked, twisting the man's wrist, forcing the knife from his grip. A quick elbow to the throat, a knee to the gut. The man went down, gasping. Frank didn't give him time to recover. He fired once. The woods went still again. Frank exhaled, scanning the trees. 3 down, that left. A gun cocked behind him. Frank froze. "Drop it," a voice said. Low, calm. Mercer. Frank turned slow. Mercer stood a few feet away, his pistol aimed steady at Frank's chest. He was older than Frank expected, maybe early 50s, dressed in a long coat, his hair streaked with grey. His eyes were sharp, but there was something else there. Something cold. "You've been a real pain in my ass," Mercer said. Frank didn't respond. Mercer motioned with the gun. "Kneel." Frank didn't move. Mercer exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't understand how this works, do you? You don't win. You just survive a little longer." Frank met his eyes. "You talk too much." Then he moved. Fast. Mercer fired. The shot grazed Frank's arm, burning hot through his jacket. But Frank was already closing the distance. He slammed into Mercer, knocking the gun aside. The pistol fired again, wild, missing its mark. Frank drove Mercer back, forcing him to the ground. They hit the snow hard, rolling, fighting for control. Mercer was strong, but Frank had spent his life in fights like this. He twisted Mercer's wrist, forcing the gun free. Then he grabbed the knife from his belt and drove it into Mercer's side. The older man gasped, his body going rigid. Frank leaned in close. "You lost," he murmured. Mercer choked on a laugh. "Doesn't matter." Frank twisted the knife. Mercer sucked in a sharp breath, his body spasming. Then he stilled. It was over. Frank pushed himself to his feet, breathing hard. He wiped the blood from his hands, looking down at Mercer's body. The last of the Hollow men. No more leaders. No more enforcers. No more men hiding in the dark, waiting to take this town back. They were done. Frank turned toward the house. Caleb was already there, leaning against the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "All of them?" Caleb asked. Frank nodded. "All of them." Caleb exhaled. "Good." Frank stepped inside, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him. Lily was awake now, sitting up, Lucky still tucked in her lap. She looked at Frank. "Is it over?" Frank crouched beside her. "Yeah." She studied his face, searching for something, then she nodded. Frank sat on the floor beside the couch. His body ached, his bones heavy with exhaustion. But for the first time in a long time, he let himself breathe. No more Hollow men, no more threats. Just quiet, just home. Caleb dropped into a chair, rubbing his face. "So what now?" Frank looked at Lily. She was safe. She had a home now. He looked at Lucky, at the tiny pup who had survived hell and somehow found his way here. Frank exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "Now," he murmured, "we live." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the blood, covering the past, and for the first time in years, Frank let it go.